talking about our standard source of meaning, which is a dictionary. So, if you want to look up a meaning of a word, you go and look up a dictionary. How does a dictionary give us meaning essentially? Because dictionary is only describing words in terms of other words essentially. When you give examples also, you are giving examples in terms of other words. Where does the meaning originate from? I mean, is there a fundamental source of meaning essentially? This is a kind of difficulty which Hobbes faces. Where does meaning come from essentially? We are also not able to say where meaning comes from. See, for the people before him, that the notion of an apple is because you see an apple and that is what it means essentially. Okay. But when we talk about language and thought and symbols, we have this difficulty of saying where does the meaning come from essentially. It is a question that we have not yet answered today essentially. There is a picture of Thomas Hobbes in the 16th century. His book called De Corpore, Hobbes first describes the view that reasoning is computation. Okay. So, he is saying reasoning is computation. By reasoning he says I understand computation, and to compute is to collect the sum of many things added together at the same time, or so this is a very archaic language essentially, or to know the remainder when one thing has been taken from another. To reason therefore is same as to add or to subtract. So, again like Leibniz said, and adding, subtracting, arithmetic is similar to other kinds of reasoning is similar to this kind of process essentially. So, this quote I have taken from this source, which is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And as we have just mentioned, Hobbes was influenced by Galileo. Just as geometry could represent motion, thinking could be done by manipulation of mental symbols essentially. Does the name Hobbes ring a bell? Calvin and Hobbes, right. In fact, Hobbes was named after Thomas Hobbes. So, Bill Watterson, the author of Calvin and Hobbes, named him after Thomas Hobbes. That is why he is such a philosophical character. Then we come to Rene Descartes, again another great thinker from the Middle Times. We know him for many things, including the Cartesian coordinates are named after Descartes. He had come, remember that all this thing was going on, this talking statues, moving things and so on and so forth, and it had become sort of acceptable in Europe to talk about these machines as being like us in some sense essentially. So, Descartes in fact goes on to say that animals are wonderful machines. He just makes this next step that they are not like machines, they are machines essentially. And then he says human beings were to except for that they possess something called a mind essentially. We will come to this Descartes problems in a moment. So, just as Galileo said that motion can be expressed in geometry, Descartes said that geometry could be expressed in algebra. Descartes is the one who invented this so called coordinate geometry and that kind of thing, but he went further. He says that even thought can be expressed in the language of mathematics, and thoughts themselves are symbolic representations. So, you can see he is building upon what Hobbes has said. Hobbes said thoughts are symbols, and now he is saying that thoughts are symbolic representations that we operate upon essentially. But this is something which is new, which Descartes brings in the notion of the mind and the body. So, Descartes is what we call as a dualist, or belongs to this thinker which says that mind and body are two separate things. So, we also often call it the mind body dualism. So, as opposed to dualism, there are schools of thought which are monoist in nature, which believe that there is only one kind of thing. Okay. So, for the first time Descartes is saying there are two different kinds of things in this world. One is this material world which he calls the body, and the other is the mental world which he calls as the mind. And he says that there are two different kinds of things. The material world of course would obey the laws of physics and things like that, and we will see later that philosophers said that mental world also should obey such laws and so on. but they are different worlds. Mind, the world of mind is separate and the world of body is separate. And this is opposed to other kinds of philosophies, other kinds of views in philosophies, that there is only one kind of thing. So, there is a world of idealism, which says that there is only the world of ideas. So, for example, in India we say there is everything is Maya, we say, right. There is everything is a world of ideas, and matter is basically a construct that comes out of our ideas. Actually, it's very complicated to think about, but maybe you can reflect upon that a little bit. As opposed to idealism, the other world is materialism, which says that everything is matter and the whole world is matter, and the matter interacts in a certain way, and ideas and minds and all this kind of stuff thing, they emerge out of this essentially, somehow essentially. So, there are different viewpoints about what the world is like there, and Descartes was a dualist. He said that mind and body are two separate things, and he says that a symbol and what it symbolizes are two different things. So, if I say chalk as a symbol, it is a compound symbol made up of these letters. So, but it is nevertheless a symbol. So, chalk is a symbol, and this thing that I am holding in my hand is what it symbolizes. So, this notion that chalk, the symbol chalk is separate, and then we have this problem that a symbol is amenable to algebraic manipulation. So, you can do thinking. What we call as thinking is basically symbol manipulation, which you can manipulate symbols, and the subject of thought is a world, the real world out there, what it symbolizes, and they are different things. The mind is different and the body is different essentially. Of course, he had to answer questions like, because see, the body or the material world obeys laws of physics, and the mind, of course, it was not clear how it operated, but it was separate. So, he had to answer questions like this: what makes a notation or a symbol notation suitable for symbolizing, and secondly, what makes a suitable notation actually symbolize. See, this problem has occurred because he has separated the world of the mind and the body. He says the mind is one thing and the body is another thing, a symbol is one thing and what it symbolizes is another thing. So, the question is, what makes a notation suitable for symbolizing? Now, that is a question that we are addressing now when we write algorithms, when we talk about knowledge representation, then we are addressing this issue as to what is this, how do you represent, how do you create a domain model, for example, how do you represent the world so that you can compute upon that essentially. That is the easier part, but the more difficult part is what makes a suitable notion actually symbolize essentially, which means that if it is to be meaningful in nature, then the world of symbols or the world of thought should be connected in some ways to the material world or the world of matter, because they cannot be independent of each other. They are not different worlds that are operating independently. Our world of thoughts is sort of in close synchrony to the world of matter essentially. If we raise our hands, if we think about raising our hands, we actually raise our hands essentially. That kind of, how does the interaction take place between the world of thought and the world of matter? So, the question is, how can thought and matter interact? Because the world of thought is different. Matter, of course, behave sort of obeys the laws of physics. What about the world? The world of thought is not made of matter, it is a different world. How can it interact with matter? That is a question that he could never answer, the mind body problem essentially, or the mind body dualism essentially. So, this brings us to what we can call as the paradox of mechanical reason. This term is by John Hogeland in his book, and the paradox is that if reasoning is a manipulation of meaningful symbols according to rational rules. So, remember that we are talking about manipulating symbols, like Leibniz says there are well defined ways of manipulating these ideas, it is not like you are doing it randomly. So, according to well defined rules. So, if reasoning is a manipulation of symbols according to this rational rules, who is manipulating the symbols? because this question of meaningful manipulation has come into it. Our thoughts are not independent of the real world essentially, they have to be connected to that essentially. So, if a fast bowler is running up and bowling, thinking of bowling an in swinger or something, he better be able to produce a real in swinger if he is worth his salt. How is his thoughts related to the real world essentially? Who is manipulating the symbols essentially? It is a difficult question to answer, because what people say is that it can either be mechanical according to some fixed set of rules, or it can be meaningful, but how can it be both? You can't have a mechanical system being meaningful at the same time, and by meaningful we mean paying attention to the meaning of what is happening. How can a mechanical manipulator pay attention to meaning essentially? So, remember that they are not talking about AI or any such thing, they are talking about human cognition, they are talking about human minds, how human minds operate essentially. So, they are trying to analyze that essentially, and Descartes has said that there is a world of the mind which is symbol processing, and then there is the world of the body which is the real world made up of physical matter, but they are closely tied together. So, when I am thinking about some real world in a meaningful fashion. So, if I got two pieces on a table, like let us say a cake and a sandwich, I am thinking about them and I have to decide should I pick up one of them. I am thinking about some real things in the world in a meaningful fashion. My thoughts about this cake and the sandwich are about real things, and I am making some decisions, should I eat this or should I not eat this or something like that. So, this meaningfulness, where does that come from essentially? How can a mechanical manipulator pay attention to meaning? It is a question I would ask you to ponder over a little bit and see whether maybe like Penrose said, human beings are special, there is something special happening in our brains which allows us to do this, or like Dreyfus said that there are some instincts that we have which we cannot automate essentially. But of course, I take the opposite view. So, this led to a lot of debate in his time. This is, we are talking about Descartes, still Rene Descartes and his mind body dualism, and some people attribute the fact that it is said that Descartes, who also gave us the phrase cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, is apparently he is claimed to have a proof of that God exists essentially, and the proof is tied to the fact that there is this difficulty about how do symbols get manipulated in a meaningful fashion essentially. But his contemporaries of course did not accept any such thing, and they would in fact mock him about this idea of a. So, you can imagine a little bit like the Chinese room, which we have not discussed in detail, but just imagine that your brain is like a Chinese room full of symbols, and there is somebody manipulating those symbols according to some rules. Who is that somebody? That is a question that we are asking. So, people would mock at Descartes and say, oh, there is a little man sitting in your head who is doing manipulating the symbols. But the problem is, as you can imagine, this explanation does not work, because the next question that you would ask is, how does a little man operate? So, little man has a little brain in his little body which has little symbols inside his head, and who is manipulating those symbols. So, there comes an infinite regress essentially, and people say that this is what led to Descartes' claim that he can prove that God exists essentially. But in the real world, what was happening as to this question, to who philosophers have tried various kinds of explanations, something called the faculty of will, which we cannot quite define, or transcendental ego, or as I said, the people who used to mock him and say there is a homunculus. Remember, the homunculus was made by Paracelsus, a little man sitting inside his head essentially. So, that is a fundamental question one has to answer, which says that if you are in modern day world going to write programs which will operate according to the algorithms that you are putting into those programs, how can they be doing meaningful things essentially. So, it is roughly equivalent to that essentially. Or I might say that if I were to implement a neural network, which is I know that the structure of a neuron, how it operates and so on and so forth, and I am just connecting together hundreds of thousands of neurons, how can that ever do meaningful things like character recognition? Of course, we know that it can be done, character recognition can be done, but the fundamental question is that is it intelligent or is it doing something that we have asked it to do. In fact, Ada Lovelace had said that the computer can only do what it is instructed to do and nothing more than that, which is of course true at a very fundamental level. So, some recent thoughts on who is doing this manipulation of thinking. There are some very interesting books, and for those of you interested, I would recommend them. All of three have a common author called Douglas Hofstadter, who is in the Indiana University. His famous book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, and he and Dennett wrote collected a series of articles called The Mind's Eye, and more recently he has written a book called I Am a Strange Loop essentially. So, he is trying to, Hofstadter is also trying to answer this question. I mean, instead of saying who, he is saying what is this notion of I that I have as a human being that I have essentially, or I or you essentially. So, if I talk of you as a person, what do I really mean? What is that you essentially? So, I say that my body, my mind, my hands, my eyes, my feet, my whatever. What is this I which is saying my essentially? That is a question which Hofstadter is trying to answer, and he sort of uses a combination of emergent behavior and self referential loops, which we do not have time to get into here essentially, but I would recommend one of these books. They are quite easy to read and quite engrossing.